Everybody, this is lecture 3 for bioethics. I'm sticking with the webcam right now while I get the other camera set up. So I want to start with two bits of housekeeping for the class. The first has to do with journals. You should be able to access your journal now. It'll have two sections in it, one for your notes and one for the weekly journals that only I can see. So I guess it's really a notebook, and one section of that notebook is the journal for the class. It's in, actually, if you go to the general discussion channel, I posted there two little screenshots showing you how to access that. So if there's any confusion, go into the general discussion channel, or just the general channel, and check out my post there. It's also best if you download OneNote, because that's what the sort of like note-taking app that it integrates with best. So the second thing has to do with supplemental readings. I haven't posted a sign-up sheet yet for people to sign up for their supplemental reading presentations, so no one needs to have done one for this week. But I'm going to post a sheet that will allow you to sign up for a particular day, and even if those days don't have readings on them, a supplemental reading is listed for the syllabus on the syllabus, you can still sign up for that day, and I will add readings for that topic. I'll go out and find some good ones. But you don't need to worry about that until I post it, and that should be posted certainly this week, in the next day or two. Yeah, so that's the housekeeping stuff. So what I want to do is, I'm not going to go over the reading that you did. I'm going to sort of go beyond it a little bit, but make reference to some of the concepts that were in the ethics reading. So this chapter goes over a few things. It introduces ethics as a sort of discipline that's broken up into 3 or 4 kinds of ethics. And that's a good way to think about it. But then we have to ask, what is ethics? Well, what about it binds those 3 or 4 things together to make them all part of the same thing? So I'm gonna go through those different types of ethics that are mentioned there, and I'm going to move on to distinguish ethics from other things that it's not, because there's a lot of common misconceptions that people bring to the study of ethics. Religion, its relationship to ethics, and the law's relationship to ethics are going to be involved in there. And then we're going to move on at the end of that to talk a little bit about the Hippocratic Oath and how bizarre that document is. If you haven't read it yet, you should read that before you watch this. And if you haven't done the readings for this chapter yet, just go back and do those, and then come back to this lecture, because you'll understand what I'm saying a lot better if you've done the reading. Okay, so we can distinguish 4 different modes of ethics. And I'm using the word mode there because I don't like the idea of calling them kinds of ethics, because that makes it sound like you can choose between these and they're all sort of on an equal keel. But it's really 4 different guises that ethics comes in, or 4 different sort of operations that ethics does. And what I mean by that will become clear as I move through them. So he mentions the first one, metaethics. Metaethics is the study at the highest theoretical level of what ethics is. So you can imagine all of these different kinds of ethics or modes of ethics as moving from the most generalized and theoretical to the most specific. So when we're doing metaethics, we're asking the really like abstract questions, like, how do we go about identifying good things from bad things? Or how should we even go about reasoning about rightness or wrongness? Those are meta-ethical questions because they're not questions about what is right or wrong. They're questions about the nature of rightness or wrongness, right? So ethics is about rightness and wrongness. Meta-ethics is about the nature of rightness or wrongness. It'll help to distinguish that, to understand the distinction, by moving on to the second one. The second and slightly less broad, slightly less abstract mode of ethics we call normative ethics. And that question is, the questions that normative ethics deals with are questions about what rightness and wrongness are. Like, what's right or wrong to do actually in your life? What are the right principles to live by? What are the right rules? What are the right virtues or character traits to inhabit? That's a normative ethical question because it's asking what actually should you do. That's what the word normative means. There is what ought you to do. Practical ethics is taking normative ethics. This is the third mode. Is taking normative ethics and applying it to a specific situation. So in normative ethics, you're asking basically the question, how do I be a good person, or how do I do the right thing in my life? How do I know what's right or wrong? Is a meta-ethical question. But how do I actually go about being good is a normative ethical question. And practical ethics says, let's apply that normative question to a circumscribed, narrow, particular situation or kind of situation. So practical ethics normally divides up into lots of different kinds. There's business ethics, and there's ethics of relationships. There's ethics of like medicine, which is what this class is. There's ethics of any discipline, research ethics. All of those are practical ethics questions. Whenever you're dealing with a specific category of work or life, you're asking practical ethics questions. So this is a course in practical ethics in that sense. And then the most important one to distinguish is descriptive ethics. And in a sense, the first three categories, meta-ethics, normative ethics, and practical ethics, are on one side of a divide, and descriptive ethics is on another. Descriptive ethics is not philosophy because it's not actually asking questions about what is right or wrong. It's asking questions about what particular groups of people view as right or wrong and why. So the descriptive ethicist has no interest or has no skin in the game when they're asking questions about right or wrong. They're just asking about, in a sort of culturally objective sense, what do these people think is right or wrong and why? How can we describe their ethical beliefs? Whereas the practical ethicist or the normative ethicist are taking the question much more seriously, as if there is as if there are good or bad answers to the question. They're trying to figure out those answers. That's what we're doing here. We're taking the question seriously and saying that we can come to something like an answer to important ethical questions in the realm of medicine. So it'll help more to distinguish ethics from some things that it's not, but that it's related to or that it affects. A lot of people, when they walk into an ethics class, assume that ethics is just the same thing as something else it just goes under a different name, like law, for instance. People think that ethics is about doing the legal thing, or maybe more often they think that law is really trying to codify ethics. Like, the reason we have laws is because we think that the things that are illegal are actually wrong. We just make them illegal and enforce those rules. Well, it's not really the case. Law and ethics are very different. because they have two completely different uh, bases on which they make their judgments, right? At least in the Western, I mean, in a theocracy, it's very different. But we're talking about sort of Western liberal um, societies like ours, where the law is based on like a constitution that has certain principles embedded in it or certain assumptions embedded in it. Like, for instance, in most Western societies, it's assumed that the purpose of the law is to make sure that everybody can live as freely as possible, right? The law is there to make sure people don't violate each other's rights. So while the law may say you should not kill people, and while most codes of ethics say you should not kill people, their reasoning is can be very different. In the American legal system, the reason you shouldn't kill anybody is because it violates their ability to act freely, right? You can't do much at all freely if you're dead, and freedom is the central thing uh, that the law is trying to protect. And in an ethical framework, you might not say that that's wise, wrong. You might say, well, killing somebody is wrong in most cases because it involves being unkind or cruel to a person, and that's what's most important, is that we embody kindness rather than cruelty. That's what you'd call a virtue ethic view, is to say that like our personal qualities are the most important thing. That's what ethics is about. Or you might say that, well, you shouldn't kill people generally because it normally causes more displeasure and pain to kill somebody than happiness, and happiness is what we should shoot for in ethics or well-being or something of a group or of all of humanity. And so that's why you shouldn't kill people. The law, though, reasons in a very different way. Another way to see the important difference between ethics and law is to consider how awful it would be if the law really was trying to just enforce ethical rules. So there's all sorts of things that most of us will agree intuitively are wrong, but that you do not want the government to be involved in. For instance, imagine a government that writes you tickets or gives you fines or jail time because you cheated on your boyfriend or girlfriend or partner. That sounds awful. Yeah. I mean, we don't want to cheat. We don't want people to cheat on each other, but we think that the government has no business sticking its nose in that aspect of our life. At least most of us do. So right there, we have a distinction between what we think the law should be and what we think is right or wrong. You can find other examples too, like rudeness. Most people think it's wrong, it's morally wrong to be rude. But imagine a world that polices, a government that polices rudeness and fines you or punishes you because you spoke unkindly to somebody at a work party or something. That's just a total dystopian vision. That's the ultimate way to parental view of the government. The government, we think in most, again, liberal democracies, we conceive of the government as something that's there to protect your freedoms, but not to force you to be good or to punish you for being a bad person. It's like you can be a good or a bad person all you want, as long as you don't infringe on other people's rights to live their lives, or whatever rights we think, right, we say in the Constitution that people have. So the ethics is not the law. Ethics or morality and law are not the same thing. They have some very loose relationship to one another, but it's a lot looser than it seems on the surface. Um, in this, I think we get this association because when we're kids, we ask like, well, why, what do the police do? And when we say they go catch bad people, and children think morally bad people, when really the police don't catch morally bad people. It's not their job at all. Moral badness has no place in any description of what the police do. The police go out and catch people who have infringed upon others' rights, who have broken laws, and the laws are there to ensure freedom of other people. I mean, good laws are there for that reason. Bad laws are there to preserve the freedom of one group over another. Yeah, but that's, I think, the root of this confusion that people intuitively have about ethics. Another thing that we tend to conflate, or at least associate more than they should be associated, is the relationship between ethics and religion. A lot of people get their ethics from their religion, and pretty much every religion teaches some ethical code. But ethics, as a philosophical discipline, is about reasoning about rightness and wrongness in a way that any person who can reason can follow you and agree with. Whereas religion presupposes that you believe a certain set of religious tenets, or you hold a certain religious viewpoint in order to follow their moral code. Right? The Ten Commandments, for instance, are given by God without any explanation as to why they're the right way to do life. God doesn't say, well, you should, don't murder because that causes harm to other people, and harm is the one thing that we're most fundamentally concerned with, or we should most fundamentally be concerned with. God just says, don't kill. And it's God's power and the assumption that God is good that sort of grounds and undergirds religious ethics or religious codes of ethics. Whereas when you're doing ethics in the philosophical sense, you want to reason in a way that anybody, whether they're part of your religion or not, can follow you and agree with you, right? You do not have to believe in a God in order for us to come to some agreement about why torturing people for fun is wrong. So that's the value of ethics, is that it doesn't require much beyond just being able to reason about things in order to get two people on the same page. And in a way, ethics offers more than religion does, because religion might give you a code to live by, but it doesn't give you the motivations, or it doesn't give you the best motivations all the time. So for instance, you might go through your whole life not stealing and not killing and doing, generally not breaking most ethical norms, good ethical norms, but you do it because you're afraid that God will punish you if you do something wrong. Just consider whether you think that person is a better person than the person who goes through their life doing good and not doing bad because they love people and don't want people to suffer, or want people to have good, happy lives. That seems like a much more noble motivation for living a certain way than just fear of God's punishment, or just because my particular religious tradition told me to live this way, that's why I do it. That's not very admirable to just do what you're told. It's much more admirable to do what you think is right because you think it's right. And that's what ethics offers, a sort of reasonable, rational grounding to views about rightness or wrongness. Another thing ethics is not is all relative, right? I rarely hear this in university settings, but people outside universities think that when kids come to college, they're just going to be taught that like everything's relative, and it's all just culture, um, and that'll like destroy their moral compass or something. And nothing could be further from the truth. I know very few philosophers who are happy to say that, oh, it's all just relative. Like that's it. That's the end of the story. Um, we know that ethical codes do change according to what society you're in, and that societies change their ethical codes over time. They develop them. But that doesn't mean that it's all just relative in this nihilistic sort of sense, because nobody really wants to swallow the bullet that and say, well, yeah, it's no, there's no difference between uh, torturing an innocent child and giving the innocent child a meal when it's hungry. That the only difference between those things is culture and what your culture has told you to do. Because there are things uh, that transcend culture in a sense, like just our basic conceptions about um, what people need in order to have a decent life, or what people want, or how people think about happiness, for instance. Happiness is a concept that pretty much every culture has some analog to. Um, and in that sense, it's not just dependent upon the culture. We all think that you're not happy if you're being tortured. Um, so nobody wants to just say it's all relative to the culture that you're in. Another downside to believing that morality is all just relative is that it makes it impossible to ever, even within a culture, to distinguish between the people who are doing the right thing and the wrong thing sometimes. So, for instance, um, Gandhi was a cultural revolutionary. He was revolting against his culture in a lot of ways. And so, in that sense, he would be considered, if it was all relative to the culture, Gandhi would be considered an immoral person because he sort of violated the caste system, which was seen as morally, or at least religiously, um, commanded. Uh, but we don't think Gandhi was a bad person because he violated his culture's views about morality. We think he was a good person because he was willing to act against his own culture. And in order to make that sort of judgment, we need some culture independent way of thinking about rightness and wrongness, and that's what philosophy or ethics provides you. Is something that is independent of culture, or if not independent of culture, you can at least transfer it across cultures and use it to make judgments. A third or fourth thing, fourthly, ethics. A lot of people bring a misconception of ethics into their class, or into the study of ethics, when they assume that ethics can be summarized really easy, that rightness and wrongness can be summarized in a simple rule. Like, for instance, everybody hears the golden rule and thinks that's like sort of the heart of ethics or something. But almost any simple rule fails. Like, it's really frustrating to try to come up with a good golden rule that everybody can follow and it'll always lead you to do the right thing. So, for instance, do unto others as you would have them do unto you is really an awful moral rule. I mean, just imagine if you just consider how that rule gives you permission to do anything to another person as long as you would like them to do it to you. Let me say that again. It gives you permission to do absolutely anything to anything to another person, as long as you would like that person to do it back to you too. I don't think we want to live in a world where people feel that sort of permission. To say, ooh, because I would like them to touch me, I can touch them. Right? But that's exactly what the rule uh, permits. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay, so maybe we need to just zhuzh up the rule a little bit and we'll get to a better version of it and that'll be good enough. But I promise you, no matter how hard you try, coming up with like a one sentence golden rule that encapsulates morality is damn near impossible. If not impossible, it requires a, a very complicated and clever way of formulating that rule. And none of us has that yet. Uh, the last thing that I want to distinguish between is not something that I think you might mistake ethics for, but it's a tendency that I think all people have at some level, and that is to mistake your view of right and wrong for your instant intuitive reaction to a thing. So, for instance, a lot of people, I mean, we live in the South. I was raised in the South. There's a lot of people who will tell you that just imagining homosexual sex between two men makes them feel disgusted. And those people are also the people who will tell you that they think that homosexuality is wrong. But what's going on there a lot of times is if you ask those people what it is about homosexuality, the homosexual sex that they think is wrong, what you find is all that they really have is that they find it really repulsive and they assume that if I have a strong negative reaction to something, that it must be wrong. And that must be my like conscience or my moral compass reacting to it. But what disgusts you is that's one thing that is entirely culturally determined. And we know that because children who were not raised in the society, like feral children who were raised by wolves or whatever, there actually are such children that have been documented and studied. They have no disgust reactions. There's nothing you can show them that makes them go, ooh, that's gross. Because they never learned from their culture what was disgusting or not. Animals don't have disgust reactions. It's something that you have to be sort of habituated into by your culture. So that's a really useful principle to keep with you, is that you should be really skeptical and critical of your own inner immediate reactions to a thing, and don't assume that that voice that goes, ooh, actually knows anything at all. It's just the most squeamish part of you on the inside, and it's not all that smart. But it's much more common than you think that you and I mistake our disgust reactions for moral judgments. I mean, just think about how, to take another case, think about how it's easier to dismiss a person and their needs if they smell bad and dress grossly. You know, like imagine two homeless people come up to you on different days. One person, and they both say, you know, I just don't have any money and I really need to eat. Can you help me? And one of them just smells like feces. It's so much easier to say, ooh, no, go away. And not feel bad at all because there's this gross person coming up to you. So it's easier to ignore their needs, their dignity as a human, if you also feel some disgust towards them. This is part of pretty much every bit of racist propaganda in all of history too. I mean, there's it's super uncreative. There's like no racist propaganda that doesn't say these other people are gross, dirty, bad smelling, whatever. And the whole point of that is to incite your disgust towards a person and to use that as a basis for you giving them less moral consideration than they deserve as a human, right? It's the Nazis made it easy for the citizens of Germany to not care about their Jewish neighbors by saying that the Jews were rats who infested the cities. If you feel disgust towards rats, then of course you want them pushed out. But if we remain critical of our disgust reactions, or just our initial, ooh, I'm afraid, or I don't like it, or I don't know, that's different, and whatever. If we just remain critical of that sort of squeamish in our voice, reactive in our voice, we'll do a lot better in our thinking about what's right and wrong, especially when it comes to people and especially when it comes to medicine, because there's going to be a lot of cases if you are working in the medical field, or at least if you're working in public health, where you're called on to see and treat a person with dignity, while they also might be somebody that you wouldn't associate with or feel some sort of culturally conditioned disgust towards. So we've distinguished these 4 different modes of ethics. Meta-ethics, which asks the biggest theoretical questions about how we should even go about thinking about ethics. Normative ethics, which asks the questions about how we know the difference between right and wrong, or what is rightness and what is wrongness, in the most basic sense. Practical ethics, which asks what is the right or wrong thing to do in these particular conditions. And descriptive ethics, which looks at groups of people's ethical beliefs and tries to just make sense out of them and document them. So we've distinguished those 4 different modes. And I've told you 5 things that ethics isn't. Ethics is not the law. They're not the same thing. Ethics and religious doctrine or religious codes of conduct are not the same thing. Ethics is not just all culturally relative, because we all believe that there are things that everybody ought not to do, regardless of what culture they're in. Ethics isn't just a simple golden rule, or can't be encapsulated easily within a single simple rule. It's much more complex than that. And ethics isn't just your intuitive, immediate reaction to something. That you don't have a conscience, really, or a moral compass that tells you good or bad, without having to think. There's not some magical faculty inside yourself that can smell goodness or badness and just lead you one way or the other. And the thing that we often mistake for our conscience or our moral compass often leads us in the exact wrong direction. So if I've talked all this time about what ethics isn't, and I've just talked about ethics as like different categories of things, what is it that binds ethics together? And what is ethics? Like, what is the core of it? And the answer is simple. Ethics is just critical reasoning about rightness and wrongness. That is all ethics is. It's critical reasoning about rightness and wrongness. You can use that as the definition for what we're doing in this course. And we're just doing a sort of more circumscribed version of it. Our ethics is critical thinking about rightness and wrongness, especially in the context of medical practice. That's medical ethics. So with that said, let's talk for a minute about the foundational document for medical ethics, or at least what is often thought of as the foundational medical ethics document, and that's the Hippocratic Oath. So you probably didn't come into these readings thinking of the Hippocratic Oath as a document. You probably just thought of it as something that doctors say. And I guarantee almost none of you, or maybe I would guarantee, I would bet none of you had actually ever read the Hippocratic Oath. Most people don't know that there is actually a long Hippocratic Oath that's been written out. Um, uh, and the only thing that most people really know is that the Hippocratic Oath. Whoa, God, cats are just they're little terrorists. Um, sorry. The only thing that most people know that is involved in the Hippocratic Oath is the oath to do no harm. So I want to bring some critical reasoning now to the Hippocratic Oath. First, let's just take the fragment of the Hippocratic Oath that everybody, or the people who know about it, know it as the oath to do no harm. Let's take some critical reasoning to that. Do you think that that is enough to tell you how to be a good doctor or a good nurse or a good social worker or a good psychiatrist or whatever? Just do no harm. Does that solve every ethical dilemma for you? If you just ask what action does no harm, it doesn't. It's hopelessly vague. Like, for instance, it harms people to stick needles in them. There's some degree of harm that's involved in that, but it does them good if you're doing it and then injecting a vaccine in them. So right there, we're not saying do no harm. We're saying, make smart trade-offs about the harm that you do and the good that you do, or maybe only do necessary harm and then try not to do harm. So now we're caught in the problem area of trying to figure out like a golden rule for medical ethics. That's again going to be very difficult. So the do no harm thing doesn't actually give you a lot of guidance. It sounds nice, but it doesn't actually tell you what to do in complicated ethical situations. I'll give you an example. This is an ethical dilemma that arose at a hospital that I had a sort of relationship with as an ethicist. We had a case where, or they had a case where a young man, I think he's like maybe 30 or so, had gotten in a motorcycle accident and was brain dead. I mean, there's just zero chance that he was ever going to be revived and conscious again. His brain is dead. Lots of his organs, though, are totally undamaged. And his family is left to make the decision what to do, whether they should keep him alive using life support until he dies, or to allow him to die so that his organs could be harvested very quickly. They were leaning towards allowing the doctors to harvest his organs and give them to people who need them, which is like a very harrowing procedure. I mean, to do that organ donation in a case like that, and in most cases a person dies and you have to very quickly get their organs, involves calling some doctor in some city in the middle of the night and saying you have to get on a plane right now to go fly and harvest this organ and get it to this other location in the next 72 hours, 48 hours or something. So what's the ethical dilemma? It's not the parent's ethical dilemma. Another one arose, and that is that the parents wanted the doctors to, as they were harvesting his organs, to also collect his semen so that they could use it, they and his girlfriend could use it to conceive a child, because his parents wanted a grandchild, and they said that the young man was planning on having starting a family with this girl. Well, prior to this request, the doctors say that they got no sense from talking to the girlfriend that they were about to start a family or that they had had a long and very serious relationship. It seemed like she was his girlfriend, but not his life partner. He didn't have her listed, and as his power of attorney or anything like that. It was only when the parents came into the picture. She didn't make the request. She didn't bring it up at all. Only when the parents came to the hospital did they start requesting that the doctors collect his sperm to create later to create a child, and didn't even have like a good plan for that because they were just going to try to take it home and freeze it in the freezer until they were ready to use it. I guess there's nowhere that just like will store your dead kid's semen for you safely until you want to use it. It's not a normal relationship to have with any business. So I don't know exactly what their plan was. I think it's literally to take it home and freeze it in the freezer. So what's the dilemma? In almost any case, any doctor who was faced with that request would certainly say no. I mean, we're not, for lots of reasons. We don't want to set the precedent of being in the business of collecting the genetic material of the dead so that other people can make new human beings out of it. That's not normal service offered by a hospital. So it's an easy no. Any doctor that I know would say, I'm sorry, that's just not what we do. I know you're grieving. I know it's awful that you're not going to get grandkids through him. I know it's awful that you lost a son. And I know you would love to look into some child's eyes and know that that was your son's child. But that's part of the tragedy, is that you're never going to have that. And we can't make the role of a doctor to, again, take people's genetic material and use it in ways that they didn't intend. I mean, it's just not our place to do that. So what's the dilemma if this is such an easy no? The dilemma for the doctors was that the parents were dropping hints that if the doctors wouldn't collect the sperm for them, that they weren't going to let his organs be harvested for donation. So now you really do have a dilemma. Do you refuse these parents, and in doing so, refuse 4 or 5 other people who need life-saving medical procedures, refuse their chance to get an organ tonight? You do that just on principle because it's not the right thing to do to harvest his material, genetic material, and use it to make another person. Sorry. Or do you go along with it and grant their bizarre request, knowing that probably they will never succeed in creating a child out of it because they don't have the technical skill, they don't have any plan for what to do with this, they don't have any medical knowledge to know how to store this material or use it later? Do you grant their request and do something that you would normally say no to for very good moral reasons in order to ensure that 4 or 5 other people have life-saving medical procedures, have access to those organs? I won't tell you what the hospital did or what the doctors chose to do, but that is the sort of very complicated decision that medical practitioners are faced with. I mean, every case is like uniquely and super complicated. So my initial point is, how useless is it to look at those doctors and say, "Well, just do no harm"? That doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me anything at all about how to answer this question about whether I should go along with this bizarre request or not. There's lots of other medical cases that we can ask, we can use it to demonstrate the same point. I mean, people who are refusing to comply with their treatments, how do you get them to, or do you continue to treat them? Do no harm doesn't tell you what to do, because most medical ethics dilemmas aren't just a matter of choosing between harming somebody or not. If they were, they wouldn't be dilemmas. We would just know not to do it. Of course, we're not just going to intentionally harm people. There has to be a much higher bar for what it means to be a good medical practitioner than just not wantonly harming people. So we need something much more complex. That's what medical ethics is going to be. So that aspect of the Hippocratic Oath, um, I think, is not very helpful, and it's the thing that most people associate with uh, doctors as moral oath. But if you actually look at the Hippocratic Oath, the actual text of the document, the Hippocratic Oath, this thing that ancient doctors, this oath that they had to take, it's bizarre. I mean, beyond bizarre. Let me pull it up here. So there's some parts that are sort of worded prettily, and it might not be obvious what exactly is meant by it. But let's just go through and look at some of the strange things that the original Hippocratic Oath requires. Hold on. I opened the wrong document. I'm an idiot. It's hard being an idiot. It makes everything hard. Um, okay, so it says, first of all, that I vow to give my money to my teacher when he needs it. That's that's not something that doctors swear to today. Or to treat my teacher's siblings as if they were my own, or his children as if they were my own siblings, or to teach medical knowledge without any fee or contract. That might be a good thing if medical school were free, but that's certainly not part of the oath that doctors are taking. When doctors go and teach at medical schools, they get paid pretty well for it, and they are implicitly agreeing to charge other people for this knowledge, charge other people an exorbitant amount of money to learn like the most important skills that we have. Um, let's see, what other things? I won't give a lethal drug to anyone if I'm asked. That's one of the big medical ethics questions that we have today, is whether people should have access to drugs and that would just end their life for them, to save them the misery of long drawn out lives. I won't give any woman a pessary to cause an abortion. And pessary is a particular sort of medical device that's still used today that is used to restrict the uterus. Normally, in cases of prolapsed uterus, you put this ring. It can have a lot of different shapes, but it's just a simple object that is inserted into a woman's vagina and keeps the uterus in a certain arrangement. And it's not exactly clear what it means to cause an abortion. It might mean to prevent pregnancy. To use it to cause an abortion would be a sort of horrific procedure, and it's not clear to me, at least, why anybody would want to do that. It would be very painful for the woman. I will not use the knife even upon people suffering from stones. He means stones in your gallbladder or um, your bladder. But I will leave it to those who are trained in this craft. So doctors were not originally surgeons. Here's my favorite bizarre part of it. In whatever homes I go, I will enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding any voluntary act of impropriety or corruption. Who or mistreatment of people, whether they're free or slaves. This means I will not rape the housemaids and slaves of the houses that I go into. Because if you're going in as a doctor, you have a sort of authority to do unto people, sort of to interact with their bodies in a certain way. And apparently rapey doctors were an issue that was significant enough that it made it into the Hippocratic Oath that you're promising not to mistreat house servants. And later it says I won't spread the private information that I acquire about my patients. It's a good thing, but not something we normally think of as central to the oath of being a good doctor. And that's the last like bullet point of the oath. But this is like a weird scattered collection of things. I'm not going to perform surgeries that I'm not trained to do. I'm going to make sure my teacher has money if he needs it. I won't give anybody euthanasia drugs. I won't use a pessary, a very specific device. I won't seduce or rape the slaves of my patients, and I won't divulge their secrets. Those 6 things. It is not clear to me at all that those 6 things cover like all the bases of being a good doctor or a good medical professional. There's a lot more involved. I mean, it's probably literally an infinite number of things that are worth consideration, just because the variety of strange and challenging ethical situations that arise is so large. So just as you can't write a 1-sentence golden rule that encompasses all of morality, you can't do it for ethics, and you can't even write an oath that really like covers all of the bases and then that sums up and gives you guidance in every case that you might encounter. What you need, instead of, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be any oath or any sort of formal oath-taking procedure. Those things are fine and probably good rituals to keep alive. But I'm saying that we need, instead of a code of conduct for doctors, we need to teach the skill of ethics. And that is the skill of critically thinking about rightness and wrongness. And that's what we're doing in this class. End of lecture. I'm going to post a sign-up sheet soon for your supplemental reading presentations, and I'm going to put readings with those dates that are currently blank. All you need to do for next time is work on your journal entries. In this case, you might sum up your thoughts about the Hippocratic Oath or about any of the sort of information we did about ethics, or write down questions that come into your mind, or you know, anything that this triggered, any thought that this triggered that's worth articulating to yourself and putting down into clear words is what you should do for your journal. Is just reflect on these things. And the Hippocratic Oath is probably the easiest thing to reflect on. And you might ask yourself what things you think should be part of an oath that medical professionals take or people working in medical professions should take. That'd be a good point of reflection. There will be more information to reflect on in the next lecture and the next readings. So all you need to do for next class is get those readings done and work on your journal a bit. I hope that that's not too much on your shoulders. I don't think it should be. It's probably a lot less than other classes are asking of you. So trying to keep your workload light and your with the amount of learning I'm trying to keep high. That's my favorite balance. So, okay, that is end of lecture at 56 minutes. Have a good week.